morning. My name is Cameron McElhenney, and I serve as the Director of Training and Education for the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. I would like to welcome all of you today to our first event in NACOLE's 2018 Webinar Series, where today we will be discussing what an effective crisis intervention program looks like. Before I turn things over to today's facilitator and presenters, I'd like to go over a few things regarding today's webinar. During the webinar, all attendees will be muted. As soon as we begin, however, you will have the ability to type in any questions you might have for Sergeant Winsky or Ms. Hendrickson. When we come to the question and answer portion of the webinar, your questions will be asked and answered as they have been received. During the webinar, you may also send any questions you might have for me as the webinar administrator in the same manner, and I will answer your questions as quickly as possible. At the conclusion of the webinar, each of you will be given the opportunity to complete a brief survey on today's event. If you could please take a few moments to complete the survey, it will help us as we move forward with enhancing and expanding our webinar program. With our housekeeping duties out of the way, I would like to introduce to you today's facilitator, Jana Lewis, a NACOLE board member, co-chair of the Training, Education, and Standards Committee, and Deputy Ombudsman at the Office of the King County Ombudsman. Jana?
Thank you, Cami. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Our first speaker today is Sergeant Jason Winsky. He's the supervisor of the Tucson Police Department Mental Health Support Team. The team is dedicated to interacting with persons in crisis throughout Tucson, Arizona, and Pima County at large. And he was recognized as the Bureau of Justice Assistance Federal Learning Site in 2018. On a yearly basis, this team interacts with hundreds of separate individuals, directing or redirecting them back to treatment. In addition, Sergeant Winsky is the co-facilitator of the Pima County Regional Crisis Intervention Team training. He has trained more than 1,000 peace officers across southern Arizona in CIT. He is also a mental health first aid instructor and has certified more than 500 peace officers across Arizona in this training. Our second speaker today is Kimberly Hendrickson. She is the program manager for Behavioral Health or Outreach Program in Poulsbo, Washington. She manages a team of behavioral health navigators who partner with police throughout Kitsap County, Washington. Prior to this role, she worked with police in King County to improve outcomes during and after police encounters with individuals with mental illness. And she has helped create the Police Embedded Navigator Program, currently operating in Shoreline and Bothell, Washington. She founded a nonprofit organization called Islanders for Collaborative Policing and has taught political science at George Washington University, Rhodes College, and Olympic College. Sergeant Winsky?
All right, good morning, everybody, and thank you all for being here. I think it's still morning for most people attending, so maybe afternoon for a few of you. My name is Jason Winsky, and I'm the Sergeant of the Tucson Police Department Mental Health Support Team. I'm going to talk to you all a little bit today about how our team got started, what the parameters of our team are, and then we're going to hear from Kimberly, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the CoResponder Program and some of the other programs that they're developing out in her neck of the woods. The first thing we want to do whenever we talk about this topic or this issue is we want to set realistic expectations. Our mental health support team at the Tucson Police Department really started several years ago when CIT training or crisis intervention training came to Pima County. Pima County really led the way in getting that training out here to Tucson, Arizona. And we do follow the Memphis Model for CIT training, which has a few core issues. One is it's the full 40 hours course. Two is we partner with community mental health resources. And third is our training is voluntary. So only officers and deputies in Pima County or in Tucson who volunteer for CIT training can go through the program. But we want to start with setting some realistic expectations, because as big of a topic as mental health is, and as proud as the work that we're doing here, we're not perfect and we're always trying to learn and get better. So the first common myth that we hear is CIT training can fix an officer or deputy who has a serious customer service related discipline issue. So you'll see the red X coming on the screen. CIT doesn't fix bad apples, and CIT shouldn't be used, we feel quite strongly here in Tucson, as a disciplinary measure. The next one we hear is, well, because we have a CIT program, that means that every single encounter that we have with a person in crisis can be resolved peacefully. And of course, all of us in law enforcement enforcement or in risk management on this webinar knows, well, that's not true either. We certainly do the best we can, but not every single one can be negotiated or resolved peacefully. Similarly, we hear having a mental health team means we will never have to use force on a person in crisis. We know that's not true. And lastly, and this is something that we've seen quite a bit across the nation, is, you know, we can designate an administrative person on the agency to kind of deal with the mental health issue. And I'll explain that a little bit more as we move through the presentation, what I mean by that as well. But I certainly feel like that is a myth as well. Okay, so now that we've talked about the things that aren't realistic expectations for having a CIT program or having a mental health team in your area, it's going to be all of these things that you're going to see on this slide here. Increased community collaboration with your agency, reduced and more calculated uses of force when they're absolutely necessary, better educated personnel, increased training from nationally recognized models, positive press, which is something we have obviously struggled with as police departments across the country, and the risk reduction of critical incidents. So we're going to break each of those things down as well. This is the ultimate goal of this kind of risk management program, of having a CIT program, CIT training, programs like mental health first aid. And if your area or your agency or department so chooses, a mental health team like the one we have in Tucson, which I'll describe later in the presentation. Really what you want is trained, compassionate, but also articulate personnel. This is kind of a sample statement that we talk about in our CIT program and training out here in Tucson, that an officer or deputy should be able to say something like this in the event that they do have to resort to a use of force involving a person in crisis. And that statement is simply, I am aware of the training, I'm aware of the escalation, I used every resource I had available to me, and despite that, I could not have resolved this situation any other way other than a use of force. We kind of make a nerdy risk management joke in our CIT program, and what we say is, that is the phrase that pays, or in this case, doesn't pay. Many of you are familiar with the sequential intercept model that are on this call or on this webinar. We certainly feel that Intercept 1 law enforcement is a big focus for us. Our CIT program is a big part of that for us in Intercept 1, and I won't deep dive too far into that. On the screen here is a sample schedule of our CIT program. I know that might be hard for some people to read. My contact information will be at the end of the presentation, and I can email this sample schedule of what our CIT, our 40-hour CIT training looks like to anyone that would like it. As you see, moving through the week, there's a lot of kind of classroom work on Monday and Tuesday, but as we move through the week, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, our students get hands-on experience with consumers of the mental health system, their family members, and then we end the week with role play or scenario-based training. So it's a very involved, very in-depth training. So like I said, this journey for us with CIT and training programs goes back over 15 years. But it was about 5 years ago that the Pima County Sheriff's Department, and then later the Tucson Police Department, where I work, decided to take that training and evolve it into a dedicated mental health team. So what does that mean? We're going to talk about that right now. Slide forward. Oops. Okay. All right. One more slide forward. Okay. These are our core CIT program values, and they became our core values in establishing a mental health support team, or MIST as we call our team here in Tucson. As we talked about before, CIT is still not a magic bullet. If there are retention issues or personnel issues that need to be handled, or an officer that's just not fit for the job, this training is not likely to correct that behavior. That's something we want to continue to remind folks of. So this is our training model here in Tucson and in Pima County. So a question that we get a lot is, well, if the CIT training is voluntary, what do we do for the officers or deputies who aren't going to volunteer for that training? So all of our officers and deputies here in Tucson at the academy level, right out of the gate, get mental health first aid training. That's an 8-hour kind, what I describe as kind of a 101 mental health course. It comes with a textbook, and it's sponsored by the National Council on Behavioral Health. So every single one of our officers and deputies, before they even leave the academy, is going to get the full 8 hours of mental health first aid training. Then, once they have 2 to 3 years out on the street and they have some field experience, we start looking at recruiting people into our CIT training program. Again, like I mentioned before, it's voluntary. This is a group of personnel on our agency that want to work with this population, or maybe even have personal experience with mental illness in their own lives or their own family members. Although the training is voluntary here in Tucson, almost 70% of our patrol officers at the Tucson Police Department have signed up for and completed our CIT training. That number is important because really, in my opinion, you want enough CIT trained officers that one or more will be available on a 24/7, 365 basis. And so we certainly have hit that number in our Field Services Bureau, our Patrol Bureau. And then we have an advanced CIT program, which is a one-day refresher course, and that's for people who went to CIT 3 or more years ago. It's a one-day, 10-hour course, and we cover some more in-depth topics that we don't have time for sometimes in the regular basic 40-hour CIT. Last year, for example, we had a 2-hour class on dementia and Alzheimer's, which would not normally be a part of our CIT training program, so we decided to make it a part of our advanced CIT training program. So what is the purpose of having a CIT program and a mental health support team? Public safety is first and foremost. We definitely think that this is a risk management model as well, but we also are very passionate about the work we do, and we think it is the right thing to do for the person involved. Okay, so evolving from a training program into a dedicated team of officers, detectives, and a sergeant, which is my role on the team. As I mentioned before, the Pima County Sheriff's Department started in 2012, and we started ours in 2013. We're going to tell you a little bit about how these teams work. In Arizona, we have a big issue, a big activity for us as a police department and a sheriff's department. And I've seen this across the country, so I'm pretty confident that wherever you might be in the country, your agency or your police department or sheriff's department is going to deal with this issue. My team is responsible for the service of all involuntary commitment orders. In Arizona, we call that court-ordered treatment, COT. I've heard it described back east and in other places as AOT, assisted outpatient treatment, is I think what that stands for. And really, before we started a mental health team, we did the same thing that most police departments and sheriff's department did across the country. And that is we served those civil commitment orders in a completely random fashion. So we would fax the court order, the commitment order, around the county or around Tucson, just geographically based upon where we thought the person lived. So a random officer or a random deputy would get this civil commitment order. It is signed by a judge. It is involuntary. The person's going to go to the hospital no matter what. But we would hand those orders out to rookies. We would hand them out to sometimes maybe the officer or deputy that had irritated the sergeant that day. It was a completely random fashion. We were not assigning these civil commitment orders in a way that took in really any regard, training, experience, or quite frankly, even the patience or passion of the officer or deputy involved. So how do we do it now? Well, my team is responsible for the service of all of these orders now. And this has really been a transformational change for us in Tucson and at the Sheriff's Department as well, because they're doing the same thing there. We've centralized the service of all of these orders. When the field personnel, patrol personnel, were in charge of serving these orders, we were serving about 30% of them, which means several hundred people per year. Their order would expire, or we would just never find the person. We would never serve the person, and that means hundreds of people really never got to treatment. I'm proud to say that by having a dedicated team now, we're very, very close to a 100% service rate on our mental health civil commitment orders now. The people we don't find are generally homeless individuals or people who have left the county are really the only ones that we're not finding at this point. And interestingly enough, that really isn't the only success of centralizing these civil commitment orders. You can also start data mining them. It turns out that only about 60% of the orders that we get, and we get hundreds of these at the Tucson Police Department per year, only about 60% of these orders are people that are new to us or new to my team. That means that a full 40% of the orders are people that we've already dealt with before, that we've already had, commitment orders for previously. That means we can start to get to know this population, understand what makes them tick, understand what some of their triggers are, what their frustrations are. We hope and we think that it's also improved the quality of care for those individuals. And that is because instead of 5 different patrol officers or 5 different deputies serving 5 orders on one person, my team's going to end up serving that order on that person 5 times in a row or 5 months in a row. So what that means is my team is able to contact that person's treatment provider and say, hey, we've transported this person every 30 days for the last 5 months. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's going on with this person, or why you think they need to be hospitalized on an inpatient status every 30 days? And the answers we've gotten from the treatment providers have been pretty interesting. Some of them have said, well, every 30 days they miss their appointment, and so every 30 days we put in a civil commitment order for the person. We have found patients on our caseload that got assigned a new therapist or a new counselor, and they have a personality conflict with that person. So they start missing appointments, we get court orders for them, and they go back inpatient over and over again. So there's a continuity of care issue there that when appropriate, and as hard as it is to share information due to the constraints of HIPAA and other things, that we can actually be part of the care or the case management component for those individuals involved as well. So as I mentioned, we're responsible for the service of all the court orders. We also follow up on cases that we think have a mental health nexus, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. Okay, so what you're seeing on the screen now is a picture of 2 of my team members. One of the things that we did when we started a dedicated mental health team here in Tucson, and I would like to say that we had a bunch of science, or we had a bunch of doctors and lawyers and people that helped us, and university professors, but really out of everything that we've done, I think what you're looking at here is one of the most successful components of our program. And it was kind of just almost the dumbest or easiest thing that we did. So we took all of my team members and we took them out of uniform. So they're not in traditional police uniforms. And yes, although you can tell that's a police car behind them, they also don't drive traditional police vehicles. No lights, no sirens, no uniforms. Of course, the obvious question that I get all the time is, what about their safety? Because as you can see, they're not wearing ballistic vests or body armors in this picture. My team members carry tactical vests, which they keep in the car or in the trunk. So if the situation arises, they can rapidly access body armor if necessary. This has, again, been a really transformational change for us at the Tucson Police Department. By taking the officers out of uniform, the de-escalation that I can see on people's faces that my team interacts with is almost immediate. 4 years into having this program, I go out with my team to serve civil commitment orders or follow up on cases, and we will actually have people on our caseload that will look out the window of their house or apartment to see how the police are dressed. They'll even say through the door or over the phone, well, which police is it? Is it the mental health police or is it the regular police? And that's because they know that if it's us, the worst case scenario of what's going to happen to them is a transport to the hospital, versus a regular patrol officer. They might be in trouble, they might be going to the jail. And this is something we also had to be really honest as we got to know this population as well. The reality is a lot of the people that are on our caseload or that we're involved with on my team have had really negative experiences with police officers in their past. That doesn't mean the police officer was wrong, or that they were necessarily the victim of a police officer, although in some cases that could be true. But the point is, whether right, wrong, or indifferent, they've had negative experiences with police officers. So taking the officers out of the traditional police uniform has been a really big shift in a positive way for us. I should also mention that taking our officers out of a traditional uniform doesn't just de-escalate the general public, it de-escalates the officers themselves as well. They feel a little bit less like they have to be large and in charge when they're not in the traditional police uniform. So earlier I mentioned that we also do mental health related investigations. And this is definitely something that we feel has been a pretty big success for us. So our team here in Tucson has 2 full-time detectives that are doing something that's kind of, well, quite different than what we're seeing nationwide. We have full-time detectives now that are investigating things that are not obvious crimes. So obviously if your house gets burglarized, Ideally, you'll have a burglary detective. If your car gets stolen, you'll have an auto theft detective. But the reason I use those analogies is because if you think about it, what kind of detective investigates neighbor problems? Or my adult son who's living with me has stopped taking his medication? Or the person I go to a house of worship with that I've known for 10 years made a suicidal statement to me at the service on Sunday or Saturday. Who follows up on those cases? Who follows up on the check welfares and the I haven't seen my neighbor call in 4 or 5 days, which is unusual? We actually have detectives now that can follow up on those things, and I think this is probably the most preventative thing that we're doing. We're trying to find that needle in the haystack, not just in terms of danger to others, but also, you know, suicidality and danger to yourself. You know, danger to oneself is something that we're looking up, we're trying to follow up on as well. Last year, in 2017, my team members received 8,000 case referrals from patrol officers. So that tells you a couple of things. Number one is there's a lot of these cases. And number two is the officers, as soon as they were given a resource or basically a button to hit on the report writing system, they're using that a lot. They're seeing mental health, they're seeing persons in crisis, they're seeing cases out there that need follow-up. It makes me wonder where those 8,000 cases went or who was following up on those prior to my team. Of course, 8,000 cases, you know, with only 2 detectives, we're able to follow up on several hundred per year. But certainly we have the data now to justify perhaps some expansion in the future. So we talk about mental health and this team as a risk management program. So a few of the questions that I get from people are number one, well, how do you afford a program like this? And that is certainly a challenge nationwide and also for us here in Tucson. What I would say is that if your jurisdiction or if your state or your agency is responsible for civil commitment orders in any capacity, one argument I would make is that your agency or your department is already doing this work. So you're already out there in the community transporting patients back and forth. In that scenario, really what you're doing by coordinating those or centralizing those on one team is just centralizing the same labor and taking it away from the field and giving it to 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 officers or deputies in your jurisdiction. I compare it very similarly to you know, a prisoner transport unit that drives a van around for prisoners. So instead of 5 officers taking 5 people to the jail, the van can just come around essentially and pick 5 people up and make 1 trip instead of 5. So that's one way to look at it, is that your agency is really already doing this work. It's just centralizing the labor in one place. I think dedicating resources like this from a risk management perspective is a wise thing that can be shown with data. I think engaging with the community before there's a crisis is a major component of what we're talking about. You know, when something bad happens, when there's that critical incident or that critical shooting, you know, that's usually the time when the community comes together and wants to have a conversation with the police department. We're trying to get out in front of those situations. We know we can't prevent 100% of them, so we're working with NAMI. We're working with our local university here. We're working with all of our mental health organizations to try and get out in front of those situations, prevent as many of them as we can, but also have an answer to the community when a negative incident, you know, God willing, very, very rarely occurs. And so I think if you look at it from that perspective, to justify the resources of having a dedicated mental health team, I think it more than pays for itself. Lastly, I'll mention, and then I'll hand it over to Kimberly. This year, or actually towards the end of last year, we launched a new CoResponder program, which pairs a behavioral health professional along with one of our mental health support team officers. They're able to ride together and co-respond out to the community together in the field. And that's been a huge win for us, but I certainly won't steal any of Kimberly's thunder. She's going to talk to us about that.
Well, I will just jump right in there. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kim Hendrickson. I work for the little city of Polesville out in Kitsap County, Washington. when NACOLE board member Jana Lewis asked me to join a webinar about effective crisis intervention programs, I absolutely jumped at the chance. I've been working on this aspect of policing since 2011, when my little town here in Kitsap County was absolutely rocked by the fatal police shooting of a man with severe mental illness. And I have always appreciated NACOLE's interest in this topic. I was very involved with NACOLE when my work began in this area, and I have a lot of respect for people from NACOLE and the work that's being done by the organization in this and other areas. One thing I've noticed through the years, though, when working with oversight professionals on crisis intervention, is police oversight entities seem to be particularly interested and engaged with what the sergeant just referred to as critical shootings. When oversight professionals focus on crisis intervention, there is a whole lot of attention paid to use of force during encounters, and as a corollary to that, the importance of CIT training and de-escalation training. A lot of focus on that in-the-moment response, and particularly when that response goes badly. This focus by oversight professionals on critical incidents or tragic incidents is completely understandable, and certainly some of the worst outcomes when police encounter people with mental health issues involves use of force, and these tragic outcomes get a lot of attention in the media, as you all know. Even though this issue is important to focus on, I think it's really important, particularly for oversight professionals, to recognize that focus on use of force needs to be accompanied with focus on other things too. Crisis intervention programs have the capacity to do things very important in the context of working with people that have behavioral health issues that don't have anything to do with use of force. And I think this webinar is a really nice opportunity to expand that lens of looking at CIT. Sergeant Winsky already has done that for us. I really enjoyed that presentation. Sergeant, I especially appreciate the thoughtfulness of your program and the thought you've put into serving civil orders and how that can be done more effectively and humanely. The use of detectives to address behavior that may indicate untreated mental illness. That's part of that expanding of the lens that I'm talking about, and that was really helpful. As suggested in my presentation, I'm going to focus solely on one aspect of crisis intervention, the co-response model, which at its very essence, as the little graphic shows, is a partnership between a mental health professional and a specially trained police officer. I'm going to make a broad argument, and I'll just summarize it quickly before I get into the details of co-response. My overall argument is going to be that co-response programs are absolutely essential to CIT. The reason why they're so essential is it gives police agencies the opportunity to not only respond more effectively to people in crisis, but to actually reduce the incidence of crisis or the probability that crisis occurs. Co-response programs aren't the only way to be proactive, but co-response programs are particularly good at addressing underlying issues concerning mental health and untreated mental illness in your communities. And that proactive approach strikes me as being far more preferable to simply responding to crisis situations. Co-response programs have the potential of actually changing aspects of the mental health system itself. There's a bit of a radical element to them, which I very much appreciate. Again, you don't need co-response programs to be proactive and to actually change your local mental health system, but it sure does help. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, there's several variations to the co-response model. The concept has been around since the late 70s, early programs in Vancouver and Los Angeles in the 80s. In its essence, as I mentioned before, it's the pairing of a specially trained officer with a civilian with mental health training. Civilian is typically a social worker or a nurse with psychiatric training. During this call, I might just refer to that individual as an MHP or mental health professional to keep my language simple. These pairings go by different names in different places. In Vancouver, it's called the CAR 87 program. I've heard these things referred to as police and crisis teams or PACT programs, police mental health liaison teams. There's recent legislation in Washington State, just passed several weeks ago, that's going to be giving more attention and funding to these programs, and they're called field response teams here in Washington. I personally run something called the Navigator program in Kitsap County. Doesn't matter what the name is, right? The point of this slide is that these different pairings actually do different things, and that's far more important than what we call them. The variations of the co-response model are much longer than what I could fit on the slide, but let me bring a few of the most important variations to your attention. The team might be a specialized unit where there's an assigned officer and mental health professional that patrol together and take radio calls and form as a consistent team. Another way of doing these partnerships is an unassigned partnership where a mental health professional or MHP is available to ride patrol with whatever CIO officer might be available during a shift. That's what's going on in King County, Washington at the Sheriff's Office at present. The team may respond to in-field calls and actually get dispatched to crisis calls while doing patrol, or like we do here in Kitsap County, it can mostly focus on after-event police referrals. Next slide, please. There can be assigned outreach tasks to mental health professional partnerships where there's a stress on a certain kind of population, homeless populations, youth populations, or it can just receive calls or referrals about anybody that seems to have a behavioral health issue. Right? The point here is that the variability of co-response is a big part of its appeal. Co-response can be created to meet local conditions, political preferences. It can be done on a small scale, right? One mental health professional can help several entities or several officers in several agencies. It can be a large financial commitment with a 24-hour dedicated unit, or it can be done on the fly and incredibly inexpensively. When I started the program in King County that we called the Navigator Program, I had a $10,000 budget. Let me repeat that. I had a $10,000 budget to hire a navigator, which meant we had somebody that we could use for 2 or 3 hours a week. So the flexibility of that co-response model means that you can start big or you can start small and work your way up as you go. I think that the co-response model has really entered a boom period. I'm reading more about these programs nationally every day. It seems like over the past 10 and particularly 5 years, this model has been catching on across the country. In Washington State, I am personally aware of over a dozen co-response programs, and with that new state level legislation that I just mentioned that was passed a few weeks ago, I'm sure there will be many more. I'll give you another example from another state. In Missouri in 2013, 31 community mental health liaisons were created that work with police and deputies throughout the state, serving something like 10,000 people every year. So what's driving the trend? Oh, the same thing that drives police reform in general, right? Tragedies drive this trend, litigation drives this trend. As I mentioned before, this can be done inexpensively. So from a political perspective, these are good programs to do if you want to try something new that's not expensive. But there's one thing driving this trend that I think is really unique and is worth mentioning on this webinar. A lot of the use of co-response is officer-driven, right? I don't need to tell anybody on the call this, but officers are being asked to do increasing amounts of workload, complex, time-consuming work relating to people that have behavioral health issues. I am hearing from officers directly about the need to have a mental health professional embedded on call available to help with these kinds of calls. So the point of this slide that I'd like you to take away is that in addition to the usual forces behind police reform, there really is an organic quality about the growth of co-response. And I wonder if maybe some of it in the future might be more oversight board driven. I am not personally aware of oversight entities that are pushing for co-response models, but there's a lot of activity out there that I don't know about, and perhaps this is a place where NACOLE might consider focusing. Next slide, please. Okay, benefits of co-response. In some ways, this is my most important slide. I've contrasted two different kinds of co-response on the screen, and despite my lack of graphic skills, I hope you all can take away the point that there's a kind of co-response that really focuses on crisis calls and a type of co-response that focuses on activity before and after crisis occurs. I mentioned Vancouver and Los Angeles before as early adopters of the co-response model, and these two cities established what I'll refer to as the traditional model of co-response. Again, cop and the mental health professional on patrol, responding in the moment to crisis situations, doing assessment, transports, on-the-spot referrals, on-the-spot diversion, and of course these have significant benefits. consultation, right? You're introducing professional expertise to a crisis scene, potential for de-escalation, potential for diversion, and of course, everyone's favorite that works patrol, the possibility of a handoff, the idea of somebody who is in crisis and needs services being taken away so officers can go to another call. On the right-hand side of the screen, you have a different set of benefits that accompany CoResponse that's devoted to doing proactive outreach before and after crisis. That is, outreach connected to police referrals. So somebody in the community is suffering from behavioral health issues and needs help, but hasn't reached that crisis situation yet. The idea here on the right-hand side of the screen is that teams do outreach to people that are at risk of crisis or at risk of arrest because of their behavioral health needs. And this can take the form of street outreach, home outreach, showing up in court. On my team, we have a tendency to take parents out to McDonald's to talk about situations of adult children just to see what kind of help we can introduce to the situation. Compare the benefits on the right-hand side of the screen. We can connect people to services with a warm handoff, not just a business card or a pamphlet. We can actively encourage a different sort of behavior to people that have mental health issues that for whatever reason have been resistant to treatment. In building relationships and doing pre and post crisis or preventative crisis response, we can actually work on doing behavioral motivation and working on people to see different options. We can create new service pathways and navigate the mental health bureaucracy by working with outside professionals to figure out how they can do things better and more collaboratively with law enforcement. We communicate across silos. As I mentioned before with my McDonald's example, we support caregivers. At the end of the day, this right-hand column shows that more proactive and non-crisis kind of outreach can actually reduce the probability of future crisis and reduce some of the burden on law enforcement for dealing with crisis situations. Next slide, please. There are many other benefits that I'd love to talk about if I had more time. One of them that's incredibly important is officer well-being. We find that having a mental health professional in a patrol car is a great way to do an informal sort of counseling service. There are many officers who, for a variety of reasons, are resistant to get help when they need it. To have a mental health professional in the car to talk about stressful situations or feelings with is a low-cost, no stigma way to extend some help to officers that often need the opportunity to talk. Many people that I know that do co-response programs find that their work naturally extends to officer wellness programs, which I think is a great trend in this area. Next slide, please. One of the most important aspects of co-response is something Sergeant Winsky has already referred to, and that's simply community appreciation. I won't read this quote. It's something that means a lot to me because this is a mom I've been working with since 2011. Having a navigator in place, having a civilian in place to talk about a son's situation before a crisis occurs to try to see what kind of connections to care that we can help provide is incredibly appreciated by caregivers and family members. Next slide, please. And at the end of the day, it really shows the tight connection between CIT and community policing. Metrics of success. This is a sore topic for me. Those of you that have worked with CIT programs or oversee CIT programs recognize that when you're dealing with people that have behavioral health issues, there's no such thing as linear progress. Someone doing great one week may be doing very poorly the next. Somebody completely resistant to outreach and unwilling to find help for themselves may change their mind after 6 months of relationship building. So statistics in this area of co-response within the CIT model are notoriously difficult to make an exact science. But that said, there are some things we can measure. Cami, if you can just pull up all the bullet points at once, that would be great. The metric that oversight entities, as I mentioned, are very interested in is reduced injury and use of force, and of course that's extremely important. But equally important when you're looking at co-response programs, and of course I would say CIT programs in general, are cost savings in terms of time, cost savings in terms of calls for service, reduction in emergency rooms visits and police contacts. We count in my program specific personalized referrals, warm handoffs, not simply giving somebody a card, but actually making sure somebody connects with a human being at a particular treatment provider or agency. I think testimonials and commendations are incredibly important metrics of success, even though they're not particularly scientific. And for me, one of the most important metrics of success is something I mentioned previously, the idea of actually changing the mental health system itself through more collaboration, more accountability, more demand for different kinds of systems. So through the Navigator program that we run here in Kitsap County, we were able to help start a behavioral health court. We're currently working on starting an assisted outpatient treatment program where families and caregivers of people with severe mental illness can petition a civil court to oversee treatment. This has been tried in Los Angeles and New York with really impressive effects. Changing systems, I think, has to be a metric of success, although, again, that's not particularly scientific. Next slide, please. I don't want to pretend that these are easy programs to manage or to run. Any oversight professional on this call that's interested in helping to start a co-response program should know about the challenges that they're getting into. If you could just put all the bullet points up, please. I've now worked with 4 cities in implementing these programs. There's always an issue with integration and acceptance. These are programs that are based upon personal relationships, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. Co-response programs typically have multiple sources of authority, perhaps a health agency that's providing a mental health professional versus a sergeant that's overseeing a program. The who's in charge here question is a really tough one, and it manages to complicate a lot of great efforts. There are safety risks included with co-response. There are tremendous information sharing obstacles involved with co-response. The most difficult thing to deal with are lack of services and options, particularly those of us that are doing co-response programs in suburban or rural areas. If you're outside of metro areas, and even those of you that are in metro areas, you know you can have the best outreach team in the world. If there's no services to divert to, you're not particularly effective. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'm running a little short on time, so I just want to skip to the last couple of slides. If you put the bullet points up, please, I might mention some interesting trends that I'm watching with co-response to give you some sense of where this movement is going. High-tech info sharing, despite the obstacles with info sharing, seems to be something really interesting on the horizon. I know some folks on this call are from Seattle. Perhaps you're familiar with the Ride Along app that enables police across different departments, across even different agencies to look at behavioral health information in order to help de-escalate crisis situations. Referral sources are starting to expand. Our program is now getting referral from fire and prosecutors, which I think is a really exciting development. Combined police-fire teams are being used in many jurisdictions. They have a lot of promise and some good data to start examining. Clinical teams, police and public health integration, the co-response movement, I think, is growing quickly, and there's lots of interesting areas to watch. Final slide, please. And the bullet points. So just to wrap this back to the general theme of this presentation about whether your local CIT program is effective. I think in just considering the comments Sergeant Winsky has made and maybe my comments on co-response, might be important to take a few steps back and look at CIT programs with these questions in mind. Are goals matching local needs? Right? Are metrics showing impact? This is the one I've been stressing. Is the CIT program reactive? Is it crisis focused, or is it actually proactive and preventing crises from occurring? Are you generating system-wide changes to something like healthcare delivery, or are you just focusing on in-the-moment situations? And I'll close with this. The most important aspect of any CIT program or co-response program is what is the street-level feedback? What are the officers saying about what you're doing? Is it making their job more easy? Is it making their job more effective? And is the community seeing the dividends of the programs that you put in place? Next slide. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you to both Jason and Kim for those wonderful presentations. We do have a few questions that have come in. So let me start with a question that's directed to either one of you. What evidence is there that CIT training reduces the need for officers to use force, and what, if any, studies have been done?
This is Jason. I'm aware of a couple of studies that have been done, including Memphis, where the Memphis model of CIT and a lot of these training programs started. The title of the article was, I think, CIT Revisited. You know, what does 20 years of having CIT look like in terms of use of force data? I can tell you that in the last 4 years of us having a mental health team here in Tucson, we've had one use of force in several thousand encounters, which is definitely lower than averages you see at other agencies or just nationwide. If whoever asked that question wants to send me an email, I will certainly send over the Memphis article on CIT and use of force.
Thank you, Jason. Next, we have the question, what can we do as a community and or society when we continue to have resources in mental health cut? We know that mental health is a serious issue and people are in desperate need of resources. So how can the police department and local oversight help tap into funds or resources?
Sergeant, do you mind if I take this question?
Sure.
Yeah, this one is near and dear to my heart, and I hope that my theme of CIT and co-response programs actually being important in changing the mental health delivery system is coming through. I think the first thing that oversight professionals and officers that want to actually change the system need to do is to realize it's not just about money. Money is critical. We all like money, and more money is always nice, but I think that there's a lot of money being used in local community mental health that's not being targeted on the seriously mentally ill. And the seriously mentally ill that are not receiving treatment because of lack of access or availability or the nature of the disease, right, are the kind of people that police are often working with in terms of behavioral health response. So one thing I can strongly recommend is for oversight practitioners and police to join forces and say there needs to be more focus on untreated and serious mental illness. So just getting a common message around this theme, I think, is the first step. And then the second piece is accountability. I mean, I've worked with many departments now that feel like, for example, the designated mental health professional on the other end of the line doesn't take their concerns seriously, or the hospitals let somebody go after too short an evaluation or too superficial an experience there. It's not wise to take sides in these debates, but I can tell you that having forums where people from different agencies that serve people that have mental illness can meet with police officers and discuss these frustrations and ones like them adds more accountability and responsiveness to the system, and that is an excellent way to get more care for people that really need it.
If I may just add on to that. I'm sorry, yes, there are several grants. There are federal grants through the Bureau of Justice Assistance and SAMHSA. So there are definitely grants that I would encourage people to apply for. Also, to echo Kim's point, there are sample policies and procedures, what we would call general orders here in Tucson, that are available online, starting with just a policy that your officers or deputies and that your oversight people understand and agree on, and that is known for how we as a police department or a sheriff's department want to treat persons in crisis. Even just starting with a policy, I think, is a really good step forward. There is one sample policy that I'm aware of that is for free online, and that's through the International Association of Chiefs of Police through their One Mind campaign. And that website is www.theiacp.org/One Mind campaign.
I'm going to add one more thing because it's such an excellent question. And Sergeant, it's something you mentioned in your presentation. You've trained your team. If they're getting pickup orders around a particular individual that seem to follow an odd pattern, why are we doing a pickup order every 30 days? to be able to articulate that question to the person issuing that order to say, well, why are we doing the same pickup order again and again and again? That's the sort of direct communication and questioning that can result in an actual change of the system, where the clinician realizes that if Ted doesn't show up for the appointment every 30 days, there are more effective ways to deal with it than an emergency pickup order. So it's being engaged in the process as well.
Okay. The next question is, the speakers have referenced the Memphis model. Can you explain what this is?
Sure, I think either one of us could probably do that. So just very briefly, because that's a very long answer. If you go online, you can Google Memphis Model CIT. It'll be the University of Memphis, I believe, is the one that hosts that webpage. It'll be the very first or second hit. So I mentioned 2 training programs in the presentation, and I want to just touch very, very briefly on each one. We're utilizing 2 programs in Tucson and in Pima County, and so are lots of police departments across the country. One is mental health first aid, and one is CIT. What's great about mental health first aid is that it has national fidelity. Every police officer or sheriff's deputy in the country is going to get the exact same textbook. They're going to get the exact same PowerPoints, and they're going to get the exact same speaker education. The National Council on Behavioral Health really tightly controls that training. So from a risk management standpoint, that's something defensible that you can say, you know, to the community, or even in a lawsuit situation, litigation. This is the same training that everyone's doing nationwide. What's great about CIT, on the other hand, the 40-hour CIT, is that it's flexible. So different agencies in different counties and different cities across the country are doing CIT a little bit differently. And that's good because it's flexible to whatever your community needs are. What I have seen, though, that's concerning to me, again, from a risk management standpoint, as particularly, is I've seen police departments that are doing a 10-hour CIT versus a 40-hour CIT. I see police departments putting a full 40-hour CIT into the training academy when a person is brand new or hired. I see police departments using CIT training as part of a disciplinary process. If you go online and you look at the Memphis model, none of those things really are what they would describe as best practices. So you might have a veteran population in your county or in your city, and so you want more classes in your CIT training geared towards veterans. I think that's great, and you should change the curriculum, and you should have classes on veterans, and you should have a veteran come and speak about their lived experience. What I don't think is as appropriate is to start changing some of the fundamental basics about CIT, and that is, it should be some officers with experience. It should be officers who are voluntary and want to work with this population, and it should be a pretty solid 40-hour or close to 40-hour class. And lastly, if possible, the class should provide the students with hands-on experience with consumers of the systems in your jurisdiction, and should feature scenario-based training. As long as you're hitting those things, you're basically a best practices CIT program.
Yeah, let me add on to that very briefly, Tammy. Especially from an oversight practitioner's perspective, I'm going to try to channel Sam Cochran here. Right, CIT is not just training. A good CIT program is really based on relationships in addition to training that somebody will get in a well-done 40-hour course. So any practitioner that's trying to assess whether their local CIT program is doing a good job, one of the first questions that I would ask as an oversight practitioner is, what are the relationships? Is there an advisory group? How many service providers do you have a direct relationship with so you can make direct referrals? How well has the police department leveraged relationships with other community organizations like NAMI to make sure, as the sergeant was saying before, in the event of a critical incident, there is a group of people that have been discussing these issues beforehand. So CIT is training, and the training is absolutely critical, but CIT is also partnerships and ongoing relationships.
Thank you. Next, are either of you aware of any public-private partnerships, for example, private healthcare or pharmaceutical companies that are being used in CIT programs?
Yes.
Well,
You start, Sergeant. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say very briefly that yes, a lot of CIT programs I know around the country are just that. Exactly. In Arizona, we have what's called a Regional Behavioral Health Authority. That's Simpatico Integrated Care, or as some of you might know, the Centene Corporation. If you don't have what's called a REBA Behavioral Health Authority, whatever you have in your county or your city that you would refer to as the payer, so, and you might have more than one. We work extremely closely with Simpatico Integrated Care here. They provide instructors. They help us providing textbooks and resources, and they have even helping us find peers to come teach. So I think around the country you see those partnerships are happening.
Yeah, and the partnerships that I would highlight for this question have to do with technology. So as CIT programs and co-response programs start to use more things like the Seattle Police Department's Ride Along app, there's going to be private companies that jump into the mix and want to provide the technology to enhance communication and connection to services. I've seen many programs produced from the private sector that look to be a complement to CIT programs. And I will withhold personal commentary about whether these sorts of partnerships are good or bad, but they're certainly very interesting.
Thank you. Next, someone is wondering, what is the best way to get their department to consider a program like this?
Well, I would certainly make the argument that executive police leadership buy-in is certainly important. Certainly, it's important to have your elected leadership as well. Certainly, to that end, if the resources exist for someone in police management or even oversight management, as well as city or county leadership, if the resources exist for those people to attend a CIT conference, and there's one coming up, I believe, in August. Going to a CIT conference is a great way to get exposed to a lot of this material. I would also mention that the Tucson Police Department, where I work, was recently selected as a Bureau of Justice Assistance mental health law enforcement learning site. So the federal government recognized us as a learning site. What's cool about that is anyone that's on this webinar, or if people are interested from your city or county or your oversight organization, the Bureau of Justice Assistance will now actually provide finance and resources for you to travel to Tucson and Pima County to do ride-alongs with our program and learn more about our program, and you can take that back to your department or your agency. There are now 10 learning sites around the country, including Los Angeles and Houston and some places back east. So if you just search for Bureau of Justice Assistance mental health law enforcement learning sites, you can see where they are all around the country. And I think a great way to learn more is to use that funding and come travel and visit one of the programs.
I'm not sure if that question was asking how to start a CIT program in general or a co-response program. If it's about the latter, one of the interesting things about the energy towards co-response I mentioned briefly in my presentation, officers want it. So if there is a CIT program already in place and you're looking for suggestions about how to then build a co-response piece to it, talk to your street level men and women, right? They're out working with these calls and they really need more tools in order to do this part of their job more effectively. So being able to show the need from the ground up, officer interest in these sorts of co-response programs, I've personally found goes a long way in moving these programs forward.
Thank you. And I think we have time for just one more question. Thank you to all of you who have posed questions for us, and I'm sorry we won't be able to get to all of them. But as a last question, we'll ask, do you have any advice for oversight agencies looking to measure the effectiveness of CI training and programs?
So we do all of the training that we do a pre-survey and a post-survey of all of the students, and we put that into a spreadsheet so we can make some nice numbers out of that on what their level of education was before the training, what the level of education was at the end of the training, but also attitudes towards the population. You know, what do you think of a person that, you know, if you know, you were told they had this or that diagnosis? So we kind of do a pre-test and a post-test, or survey rather, so we can measure our students' satisfaction with the course and also their education and their culture towards working with this population. Obviously, we track all of our uses of force, not just on my team, but department-wide, very, very closely as well. And then if you're involved with civil commitment orders at all, I think a great thing to track is how many of those you're serving successfully and how many uses of force you have or don't have in serving that population.
I think we're in an era now where everyone wants metrics. There's a focus on metrics, and I'm the first person to say metrics are absolutely essential in supporting programs, justifying programs, expanding programs. But I think the comment I'd like to close with, so for oversight professionals that are trying to evaluate an existing CIT/co-response program, nothing beats putting the piece of paper and the report down and actually talking to street level officers. I have just learned so much about how to improve my programs, how to be more effective by just actually talking to the men and women that are actually doing the job, interfacing with people that are suffering from behavioral health issues and saying, are we giving you the right tools? Did you get the right training? What else do you need to do your job effectively? So again, I'm not anti-metric. Metrics are essential. And there's lots of places you can go to see what the standard metrics are for CIT programs. But I think practitioners have a real professional and moral obligation to put the paper down and actually go and talk to officers about what's working and what's needed.
Thank you to both Jason and Kim for an excellent presentation today. We've already begun receiving quite a few comments from attendees about how beneficial the information. So on behalf of NACOLE, thank you to both of you for being with us today. Thank you to all of our attendees for being at today's session and for taking a moment to complete the online survey that will be sent out shortly. We are currently finalizing the next webinar in our 2018 series, so please stay tuned for additional details and registration information. To having you at future NACOLE training opportunities. Thank you.